Hi everyone, welcome back to Casual Watch Review channel. Today I've got a special guest, Andy from Tea and Tickers channel. Thanks for joining me, Andy.
Hey Sam, thank you so much for welcoming me. Yeah, great to be here.
Andy and I have been having a chat about smaller watches and we thought this would actually make a great upload. So this is the premise for today. Top reasons to add smaller watches to your collection in 2023. And I've got to say, I'm not totally convinced, but Andy is here to convince me and maybe you guys as well. But before we start that, Andy, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about how you got into watches.
Since a very young age, I was always, curious of my dad's watch. And it was kind of a morning ritual. I'd see him, with a watch in the morning, winding it to his ear. And it just kind of something what stayed with me. Yeah, and it was just a tradition he had. He never had anything kind of luxurious, but he was always wearing a wristwatch. I mean, I guess through my teens, like every teenager, you start to get the Casios, the classics. And then that was it for a long time. I had a few fashion watches in my early 20s. And then I started watching a channel called Producer Michael in 2019. And that really sparked my curiosity into luxury watches again. That kind of links to how I got into Tea and Tickers as well. I was just enjoying live streams, shows like yourself, content to learn more and more about wristwatches. And then I think one day I bought a Crepers, which is a complete flip side, a massive watch, like over 50 millimeters. And it was a military kind of issue inspired watch. And then, obviously we know John from Tea and Tickers is, a big military fan. I just hit him up, say, I've got a really cool watch, what I think you might be interested in. Do you want me to send you some footage? And he's like, no, come on, unbox it, talk about it. And then ever since I did that unboxing, I just kept getting a StreamYard link, like, hey, do you want to come back on? Do you want to come back on? And then got sucked into it, and here I am today. So that's the short version of it all.
And your collection has all sorts of different types of watches in it, but I've noticed the last couple of times we've been on live streams, you've had more smaller watches. I think the smallest I've ever worn was a 36mm CWC G10, and I wore that for a long time. And the watches that I inherited from my grandfathers are all quite small watches, but as I got more into watch collecting, I found my sweet spot was really around 39mm or more. In fact, I had a 38mm watch, and it was weird how that just one extra millimeter mentally didn't gel for me. Although I know watch sizes are really all over the place, aren't they? You can have 40mm watches that look monstrously big. What I was thinking we should do is talk about how you see smaller watches and why you think that everyone should really have one in their collection. How did you get into smaller watches? I'm saying they're smaller watches, but at one time these were just watches, weren't they? Most vintage watches are smaller.
It happened in a very, very strange way. So when I say strange way, I was buying mainstream pieces. Rolex had a 40mm, I think it was the Air King, not the newest Air King, the one before. And looking at that watch, if I reflect on that piece, I used to like wearing it, but I also found it, especially living in Spain, I found it quite uncomfortable at times. My wrist would sweat. Even if I used the Easy Link, it was still not so comfortable. Yeah, I just found myself not wearing it for long lengths of time. And then I got into the community, like the watch collecting community here, who are more focused, or the group who I've met here are more focused on vintage pieces. And they started to introduce me to, hey, try this old Piage on, it's so cool. And I'm like, it looks like I could wear it like a pin on my jacket, it's so small, this isn't for me. And then just, you find yourself adjusting to these pieces. The more you try them, the more you expose to them. And the more you wear them, you start to accept them for what they actually are.
Okay, and these more modestly sized watches, are you finding that the tide has changed generally in the collecting market? Are they harder to come by, or have the prices gone up recently?
Vintage Cartier has started to skyrocket. It's getting a lot more popular. Piage, not quite there yet, but I think is more interest in Piage. It's definitely a brand I appreciate, and it's just how much value you get in these pieces. So if you can get past the initial size shock and appreciate it as, I try to look at a smaller piece such as the Tank. It's not a watch, it's a bracelet, like I'm wearing bracelets here. It's basically like a bracelet what can tell the time. That's how I see it, more like a piece of jewelry rather than it being a watch. And I think if you get into that mindset, it becomes a lot easier to wear them. And you get so much value. You can get a Piage for 3K, for example, with a stone dial, solid white gold, for like €3,500, which is, pretty much the same as dollars right now. So you get so much value for your money in these older pieces. And with them being vintage and being more and more collectible, I believe, is also good. I'd never recommend to buy something for investment, buy it for enjoyment, but there could be upside, connected with that as well.
Christopher Ward released a 36mm watch. They style them as unisex watches, and then there's been other brands as well that have gone smaller. Do you think this is a trend that's going to stay?
I think it needs to stay, right? Okay, I've got a crazy piece, like the Mr. Roboto, which is a complete flip side. It wears a lot larger, like 45mm, maybe almost 50mm. I'm not quite sure on the exact measurements, but it's quite a large piece. But it's different because it doesn't wear like a traditional watch whatsoever. But if we're talking about the traditional watch shape, once you get into 44, 45, for me, it's not complementing your outfit. It's not, you're drawing attention to the watch and not to yourself. So if you're wearing a watch to look stylish, to look, classy, especially when you're buying luxury watches, I believe that's why a lot of us do that, right? It's not drawing, to me, it starts to take away rather than add any kind of class. So I think 40mm really is a sweet spot. For me personally, a 39 is fine, or even a 36. Like the Datejust 36 for me is a perfect piece, for example. I have no issue with that. But for some people, that's a girl's watch, which is crazy. But I think we need to get past that maybe in the watch community and just wear a watch for what it is. And it's all relevant to your wrist size, right? So if you've got a small wrist size, then of course smaller pieces don't look so small. If you have a larger wrist size, then of course it makes more sense to wear a larger piece. So I think that's how you need to look at it, really. What fits your wrist rather than what the community kind of dictates to you what you should be wearing.
My Datejust that I bought is a 41mm, and I was surprised in the comments section how many people thought that was a monstrous size to wear for a Datejust. I actually think it's a perfect size. I've just been reviewing a Casio Edifice, and this is 45mm. It's low profile, it wears quite well, but it is a larger watch. But I would say on the wrist it's not that far off how the Datejust looks. So its size is so weird, isn't it? And I had a 38 or 39mm Seiko speed timer, and I thought that was too small. Also, it was a chronograph as well. Interesting to see how vintage watches, that was what the size was. In fact, it was probably the more expensive watches that were the smaller ones because of the technology. It's like, I think of it like mobile phones in the 90s, where everything was going smaller, and then the iPhone hit, and then everything was like bigger. I had a little Nokia that was probably the size of 2 packs of chewing gum, and I thought I was the bee's knees because I had this like smaller phone.
The 8210, right? Nokia 8210, I think that was the classic. It was like this.
If you're getting into smaller watches, or somebody's interested in smaller watches, what do you think are the top brands that offer the best value? Are they the main brands, or are there some vintage brands that are no longer around but that still offer a great value?
Great question. So if we want to talk about a brand what's not around, I believe the brand is called Butcheron Paris. Don't quote me on the exact pronunciation, but I believe it's Butcheron Paris. And they are very, Piage, Cartier inspired. As long as you don't have an issue with quartz, as quite a few of these pieces are quartz, but you can get these amazing like Art Deco styles, small, not crazy small, but the smaller size, like the Tank kind of style pieces, and you're paying maybe $1,200 to $2,000, $3,000 depending. And that's maybe a forgotten brand, which is kind of cool and stylish. Like they have bracelet designs where there's no buckle at all. It actually connects at the top of the piece to the case. So, quite a lot of innovation and style. The only downside is if you buy a vintage one and the bracelet is not for your size, you need to get a custom leather strap made again in order for it to fit your wrist, because there's no buckle whatsoever. But they're really cool pieces. Then obviously Cartier, gosh, it's just a different world. Vintage Rolex Cellini, such as King Midas, but it doesn't have to be the King Midas. I'd say many of the rectangular vintage Cellinis, or Cellinis should I say, are fantastic. They're great pieces to look into. Be careful with some of the circular vintage Cellinis. They weren't built quite as well, I'd say, as maybe the more modern rectangular shapes of that era. And Piage, again, just a beautiful brand, which is still around today. But I wish they would go back to what they used to do, rather than trying to make the thinnest watch in the world. If you remember the 1970s Polo, that's very similar to the Midas almost. It's all integration, clock face blending with the whole bracelet. And then now, if you look at the new Polo, it's very similar to some other, very popular steel sports pieces out there. So I wish I'd kind of revisit their past a little bit more. However, there's great pieces in their past which you can get for a great price versus their modern pieces. So it's kind of a win-win. But I'd say they're the top brands to look into. So like Butcheron, Cartier, Piage, vintage Rolex, Cellinis. I'd say as 4 brands to look into, that'd be a good starting point. Definitely a lot of value as well in Vacheron Constantin. If you look into their vintage pieces, they have some beautiful Art Deco, and also Audemars Piguet. You can get 34mm circular design, all hobnail. The whole watch face is hobnail, the lugs are hobnail. Looks awesome, and you buy these for like 3,000, 4,000. It's insane value. Buying vintage, you get a nod to the past where people dress smarter, 3-piece suits, when gangsters dress smarter, for example, versus modern day gangsters in vests and, tracksuit bottoms and the biggest gold Rolex they can find. It's just a nod to the past where things were a little more elegant, a little more classic. And for me, I like that connection with the past, but, doesn't mean it's for everybody.
When you're looking for these more vintage watches, is there forums or special groups that specialize on these type of watches?
It really depends on your country, right? One piece of advice I would say is it is a black hole, and there are many Frankensteins in that world. If you're looking at vintage Cartier tanks, for example, just to give a really easy reference, many of the old tanks were gold plated, and many of the old tanks weren't mechanical, they were quartz. So quartz from that era was more of a fashion watch. I wouldn't look into quartz vintage tanks. If you do, check it's the original quartz movement. There's a good chance it probably isn't. And if it looks pristine, make sure it's not being replated, because also there's a good chance it's being replated. Depends though. If you're happy with that, if it looks amazing and you're not buying it for originality, then that's fine. But if you're looking for something that's all original, then they're the key kind of things to look out for. As in terms of communities, I'd say your local Red Bar. I run the Red Bar here in Barcelona, and it just so happens a large part of that community are all focused in vintage. And I have some vintage watch dealers in that community who have educated and helped me learn a bit more about vintage collecting as well and what to look out for. They've also sold me a lot of these pieces as well, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Take away from that what you will. It's a bit dangerous, but yeah, surround yourself by people who have those kind of pieces and try and learn from them. Also, I'd say Instagram is a fantastic place for education. There's mega collectors who solely buy pieces like this who are extremely approachable, such as Ronnie M, who's an absolute legend. He inspired me with my collecting on vintage pieces in particular. I started to sit, when I say the hobnail AP from before, that was Ronnie M's piece, which I was like, wow, that must cost 12,000, 15,000. Then, wow, it's only like 4,000. So with people like this, you can actually approach them, send them a direct message. Like, don't everybody start spamming and say it's from me. But if you message somebody like Ronnie M and just say, hey, look, I found this piece in Chrono 24. Can you tell me what you think to it? He most likely will give you a bit of time, because he's genuinely passionate about watches and collecting. And these kind of people are always willing to share their knowledge with you. So, reach out to collectors who on Instagram who maybe collect the kind of pieces you're interested in, and just say, hey, you've got an amazing collection, could you give me some pointers? So communities, local collecting groups, Instagrammers who have collections what you look up to, inspire to have, they're the kind of approaches I would take here.
So we went through all of the top reasons you should add a smaller vintage watch or a smaller watch to your collection in 2023, that they were, in most cases, they're more wearable. There's more value when you're looking at vintage watches. You can get some really quirky designed watches that probably won't ever be made again. And then we went over what a cool community is forming around these smaller watches. The last question though, is there any watch that any of these vintage watches that you are still on the hunt for?
It never ends. I would love to get a vintage Vacheron in my collection. There's one available. The vintage references are horrible to remember. But I'll share an image with you which has these beautiful Art Deco lugs on it. I'd love something similar to Ronnie's AP with the old hobnail. And there's a few Cellinis which I'm looking out for, like the classic Doctor's watch from Rolex as well. In a dream world, I'd love the Cartier Pebble, right? The original Pebble. That'd be my grail piece. If we're talking grails, or a vintage Crash. So if I ever make it, if I win a lottery, then certainly they're the dream. They're my grail pieces, the Pebble and the Crash. But yeah, the journey never ends because you're constantly introduced to new pieces which you didn't know existed. And that's what makes it so exciting, right? I didn't, to be honest, until Cartier released the new Pebble, I had no idea that piece existed. And then all of a sudden, a lot more hype builds around that. But yeah, let's see where I end up.
Andy, thanks so much for joining us. Guys, if you're not familiar with the Tea and Tickers channel, we do a bunch of collabs together. I'll leave a link in the description down below. Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe and hit that thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. And we'll see you next time on Casual Watch Reviews. Thanks. Bye.